Hello everyone, and a very warm welcome back to the channel. I'm just coming on for this video to put my concluding thoughts down about the excellence that is Nuts, the Battle of the Bulge card game. And I hope you found my previous video on how the game works, as the sample playthrough of turn one, interesting and a reasonable explanation of how this game plays, because as you'd have seen from the previous videos, it's a very simple package, effectively two very large decks of cards and a thin sheet of rules for both the North and the South decks. And there is an awful lot to be said for this game, because despite the apparent simplicity as represented by its physical components, there is a huge amount going on in this game. There is so much chrome. If you are generally interested in the Second World War, I think you'll find this game enjoyable. If you're a Battle of the Bulge aficionado, you will love it. There is so much attention to detail. There are so many personalities represented. I mean, people like General Gavin pop up. You know, they take it to that level. And I know he's a major player, but there are probably simplistic Bulge games out there that would only have the very top tier of both armies' leadership. The units are beautifully done, down to regimental and sometimes even battalion level. So everyone gets a look in. I like the aesthetic of the cards. Not so sure about the garish card backs, but I do love the way that they're laid out. The information is incredibly well presented. They may look a bit dated, and I think players have become accustomed to less text-heavy components. So you see the average infantry formation, and indeed the armoured formations, to have a lot of text, and all that does most of the time is tell you what the other formations are that constitute the parent division. Now these days you'd probably do it more by just retaining the unit designation at the top, or for the more visual effect, the unit patches are there anyway. But that's just an extra layer of info to ensure that you know what the component parts of the division or other organization are. And that is important in the game, because as I mentioned in the previous videos, you get combat bonuses for maintaining your divisional integrity in both attack and defense. So you do find you have to pay attention to these. Sometimes, if you're used to the game or you're a Bulge aficionado, this won't be a problem. But if you're not familiar with the topic and you just happen to find yourself playing this game, you may find you're squinting at these quite a bit just to double check. And the font is not huge. I mean, I've got terrible eyesight, and squinting is necessary for me. Yes, the detail. I love that there are so many intangibles represented alongside the tangibles. So a big element of the Battle of the Bulge and the story of that campaign is the behavior of the SS units, and how on earth do you weave something a bit controversial like that into a game like this? Well, the game does it really, really well, and it's through the use of event cards that have a direct impact on the play of the game. So here's an example. You have the German card Fanatical SS Effort. It gives you combat bonuses, but at the same time your SS units participating in that action will suffer additional casualties. And that's a great way of modelling the fanaticism with which some of these units pressed home their attacks. On the Allied side, their behaviour and deportment is represented as well. I mean, this game would never be able to shy away from something like the Malmedy Massacre. And this and other cards like it, which are based on other SS atrocities, give the US some fairly decent defensive bonuses in subsequent battles where units have suffered attack by SS units. It's actually really poignant, because of course the photograph illustrating that card is the Allied official record. You can see the numbers next to the bodies which were recovered where once friendly forces moved back into the Malmedy area. So there's gathering proof of the war crime that took place there. So yes, unsurprisingly, After there is also an SS Scare card in the game, which affects the morale of units, and then there's cards like this, which represent the righteous anger that the GIs felt when confronting SS units later in the campaign. So all of that is really beautifully modelled, and if you want an example of just how far they go with this, Patton's famous prayer for good weather is in the game. There is an event card, Patton's Prayer, based on the prayer he composed and had typed up and issued to the army through its chaplain corps, basically to get the troops praying for for a break in the weather. And you know what? Funnily enough, it was granted. And the play of that card in this game has the same impact as a Weather Clears card. It's just so nice that they've included Patton's Prayer. I never had Patton down as much of a praying man, and he sort of ruined the effect at the time, I think, by saying that he was praying fervently for good weather because that would make it suitable for ass-kicking operations, and he wasn't wrong. So yeah, that is another thing that makes a good game really great. Now, I suppose I should balance these comments by revisiting the a slightly awkward topic of, does this game have any problems? Now, I'd say yes, it does. They're not going to be problems for everyone. You'll have noticed in my demonstration that this game relies on what's called the bucket of dice combat system. You total up your combat factors, each one's worth a dice roll. Not all gamers are huge fans of the bucket of dice system. Even in a game like this, where the dice results are carefully nuanced, so that, let's say, for example, an infantry unit. Of course, the infantry only hit on 6s, armour and artillery hit on a 5 or a 6. So that's a nice, perhaps simplistic, but a nice way of modelling their relative capabilities. Infantry 6 sounds a bit harsh, but infantry ratings tend to be higher. But bucket of dice can be a slower system. There's statistical arguments that have raged ever since bucket of dice first appeared as a system as to just how accurate it is. I personally find that the results of combat in this game are fairly true to the history. There are odd surprises. You get what you think should be a surefire German victory stymied by a small force of US soldiers grimly hanging on to a piece of defensible terrain. But that happened many, many times in the Bulge. And then similarly, you might get a strongly manned US position that is broken, blitzed, outflanked. Again, large pockets of US troops were bypassed and surrounded. So the unexpected can happen, but it's not a common occurrence. I mean, there will be breakthroughs. You'll never get through a game without either the German player groaning because his strongest punch has been beaten back, or the US player groaning because a bit of line that he thought was secure has been prized apart, and all of a sudden he's got to worry about what's happening in his rear because, panzers and mechanized troops are streaming through the hole, potentially unhinging the rest of his line. Another thing is duration of the game. If you play an individual theatre, say Bulge North or Bulge South, the game can be over fairly quickly. We're talking a couple of hours, and that is long for a card game, but it's short for a war game. If you play the entire theatre, that is a very different kettle of fish. The game can go on, and you do get some games where exceptionally bloody, indecisive fighting basically brings both sides to a bit of a grinding halt and turns the whole affair into a slogging match. And then you find if both sides are too weak to really try and press an advantage afterwards, you're really just ending up waiting for the clock to tick down, and then the German player concedes defeat. If you're really sure you've got to that stage, it's probably better to just concede. But that does not happen every time, and it's also a plausible outcome for the Bulge campaign. In some respects, the two sides did fight each other to exhaustion, and the breakthrough only happens when better weather permits the Allies to use the aerial muscle that they have, and when fresh units are brought up. units which the Germans are no longer able to match because they've shot their bolt. So plausible outcome. As a wargamer, I find that a perfectly plausible outcome in a bulge simulation. In terms of the cards, factual accuracy, lack of errors, I would say there's one or two things. Now, according to the rule book, the Ore River, which is in Zone 1, the easternmost part of the line, according to the rule book, that's to be regarded as bridged in multiple locations, so it imposes no benefits or detriments to either attacker or defender. And yet, confusingly, you get it as a river card. You get two of them in the US deck and a couple more in the German decks. And contrary to what it says in the rulebook, they have the full defensive capabilities of rivers. And that, I'm afraid that has never been explained, at least not in any way I've been able to find out. So my personal ruling is this: because it's not marked in red, it's not a starting piece of terrain. I rationalize, I could be wrong, but it makes sense to me, that if you play this card, it represents either the movement of bridging resources or a change in the weather, which is, I don't know, unfrozen parts of the river, or similarly created a situation whereby it's no longer fordable unless you have a bridge, and it becomes useful defensive terrain by both sides. It's a bit like the terrain in the rest of the game. If it appears, it becomes an objective people fight for. If it doesn't, then it doesn't. Some people are uncomfortable with that mechanic, how can terrain suddenly appear? And I touched on this on one of the previous videos, but I'll just say again that in keeping with this theatre, and indeed with a couple of others during the Second World War, and indeed other wars, the most insignificant of towns and villages end up becoming household names because the armies happen to converge on those points, or units of the armies happen to converge on those points. Who's to say in an alternate universe that we might never have heard of Bastogne? I mean, I know it's a strategic crossroads town, but what if the German advance had been a little quicker? What if the US had precipitately abandoned it without making a stand? You never know. And I like the way that Nuts recreates that uncertainty. The household names and the major fortifications are all there, especially the forested ridges, Elsenborn, but they may or may not have that strategic value in the game. So, be prepared for anything, really. It's good. It keeps you thinking on your feet, I feel. Before I finish, I'll just talk about two elements in the game's rules which are not problematic as such. They're actually a good thing. Now, this game is designed primarily for 2 players, but it can support up to 4. And the options given in the rules are, if you have an experienced player trying to teach, say, 2 newbies, it's a good idea to give the 2 newbies the US side and the experienced player takes the German side. That's a great teaching aid. When you combine the North and South decks, you can have, well, you generally, it's accepted that you'll maintain the draw decks as separate for North and South. There is an optional rule in there for if it's a 2-player game where you're playing the entire campaign, the entire theatre, shuffle both decks together. Just have a mega deck. I've only tried that once. It didn't go very well, but I think that's more an indictment of my terrible shuffling rather than the game itself. But statistically, the problem is there. If you combine both the decks, you run the risk of reinforcements either appearing in droves, in which case your enemy is in trouble, or not at all. You might get loads of event cards at a time when you really need boots on the ground. So the size of the decks when played individually or separated when you're playing North and South in tandem generally ensures that you will get a steady trickle of units. Sometimes you'll get a lot, but it'll be a steady trickle. Combining them, I'd say, is statistically iffy because you never know quite what you're going to get, even if you're a good shuffler, not ham-fisted like me. So that's the only play mode I would perhaps warn players off, but maybe I could equally be told that I actually need to try it a couple more times before I write it off. one day I will, and I might change my mind. So I think on the whole, I'm very, very pleased with this game. I generally don't regret most of the games that I've bought in my time, but this one, I am really pleased that as a young undergraduate, I wandered into a game shop near my university, my college, and I saw this on the shelf. I was intrigued. Both volumes were there. They weren't going for very much. I think I paid less than £20 for them back in 2000. So it wasn't a lot, even, well, wasn't a lot even back then. Um, and I've never regretted it. I've had tons of fun with this game. As I've said before, I make a point of playing it several times a year because it is so much fun and it is so engaging. And if it drags on for a couple of hours, so be it. You can alter its parameters yourself if you want to. I've discovered that not only does this game solitaire surprisingly well, you can also, if you very slightly alter the rules for playing the German bypass route card, you can actually play a single column of a single theatre. If you just want a quick game defending a very focused corridor and just dial down the German victory conditions to getting a single armoured unit off the end of the map, you have a very tense game still with somewhat more thought, than you would expect. Otherwise, the temptation is to think, well, you're just defending a single corridor. Where's the tactical side of it? But you still have decisions to make, particularly in terms of either spreading your forces thin to prevent German blitz moves, or staking everything on holding a strategic location. There's still choices, and the Germans equally have to be quick on their feet. So it's a really, really good game that way. As an easy game to pick up, I rate it very highly. As a simulation of the Battle of the Bulge, surprisingly, for a game with such simple mechanics, it is excellent. It is easily one of the best Battle of the Bulge games I own. And I would, and although I appreciate it's really hard to find these days, there aren't that many copies wandering around. If you can get hold of a copy, either beg, borrow, buy if you really want it, give it a try. I think you won't be sorry. You won't regret the experience. It is a fun game. It can be quite a sociable game. I've certainly found that to be the case. There is a certain element of deep enjoyment of dice chuckers, because you never know what's going to happen when you roll 20 dice, but there'll be some good things. There'll be groan moments when 18 of them turn out to be misses, but that's life and that's dice. So definitely try it. I think I certainly hope you'll have as much fun as I have with it. And I think that's really all I have to say. So as always, thank you so much for your company on this one. I hope it's been of use and or interest. Really appreciate you stopping by and tuning into the channel. And until we next meet, thank you very much.